Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. I finally got set up to do some tutorials. I figured I would start with a gunpowder art. A lot of people are curious as to how it works. So whether you're just tuning in just out of curiosity or whether you're tuning in as a tutorial, take a look at some of the techniques. They're pretty cool. And a few things that you need to know about this before you do begin if you are going to use this as a tutorial. You want to make sure that your canvas is primed. I usually do 3 layers of gesso, sanded in between each layer. You also want to take all fire precautions because the flame can get up to a foot, maybe 1.5 feet. Just depends on how much gunpowder is laid onto the canvas. And you also want to do it in a well-ventilated area. If you do choose to do it in your home, just know that your fire alarms are going to go off, your smoke detectors are going to go off. So whether you pull out the batteries for momentarily or you just deal with it, just know that it is going to go off. And take a look at the video, it's really cool. Not a lot of people do this kind of videoing and kind of art, so it's pretty unique. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, and you'll get, if you click the little bell, you'll get notifications as to when I upload. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to ask me. Have a great day and enjoy the video. Thanks. Hi guys, I am going to show you how I do the gunpowder art. A few things to know before you start. I am using a gallery wrapped canvas. It is a 15 by 30 inch. I have primed it with 3 coats of gesso and sanded in between each coat. Then I went through and created the background with just some Liquitex Basics acrylic paint. In any design that you want, I wanted some texture going on and the main focal point to be the mare and the foal. You can do it however you wish. And then you want to collect your supplies. So the first thing that you're going to need is some gunpowder. I use the 296 powder by Winchester. The next thing that I'll be using is a blender brush. You can use any size. I just use it to collect the powder. Once I pour the amount onto the canvas, I use it to collect the powder and just move it around the canvas. A dagger brush. I like the 1/4 inch dagger brush. That helps to really get into the details and move it around wherever you need it. The next thing is a smudge tool. This is generally used for taking off oil paint off of the canvas and kind of squeegeeing it off. I like to use it to create some sharper lines as well as create some textures. In the grass, once the gunpowder is laid down, I can go through and move it around and create some of the finer details. And then the last thing that I'll be using is just a number 5 round brush. Any cheap one will do. I used that for some of the bushes over here just to create some different kind of textures going on to give it a realism effect. Alright, so let's begin. We're going to pour a amount onto the canvas. I think I'm going to start with the face of the foal. Just a small bunch of gunpowder there. And then I'm going to begin taking just a little bit at a time. And I have gone ahead and sketched out my design using a pastel pencil. It seems to be the best to blend when it's all finished. I've tried graphite before and it left the graphite on the canvas and it was really difficult to get off. So I suggest if you're going to do it, I've found that the pastel pencils seem to work the best. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go along the lines that I already have, and in my reference photo this area right here is fairly light, so I don't want a thick line. So I'm just going to take a small amount and start following the line. And this just makes it easier as I go if I create my outline a little. It makes it easier for me to follow as I go. And try and group them and get that line as clean as possible. I'm going to go through with the smudge tool and just clean it up. And one thing with the gunpowder that you have to be careful of is, first off, the reason why I do the 3 coats of gesso sanded in between is to create that nice smooth texture. The texture of the canvas and the size of the ball gunpowder can create, it can make the lines move. So for instance, it can make them pop out of place. So the smoother the canvas, the easier it is, it's going to go on and cause you a lot less issues going forward, because it is kind of like an Etch-a-Sketch, and once you move the canvas, you've got to replace just like that. As you can see, everything kind of shifted. You have to be super careful. But once you move the canvas, everything will shift. And so you've got to recreate your lines. I'm applying quite a bit of pressure just to make sure that I'm creating that nice solid line around. So since I have the outline in this area, I will go ahead and light this part up. Now what you want to make sure you do is to remove this gunpowder right here, because sometimes the flames can get large and you'll end up catching this on fire. So this is what I use the blender brush for, is just to kind of sweep it out of the way very carefully, because all this gunpowder is small, minute balls of powder, and you don't want to light anything that's not in your outline. You don't want to catch that on fire and burn that into the canvas. It will create a fuzzy outline. So what I will go ahead and do is take a long lighter, just like this. You can use, you know, a hand lighter. That would be perfectly fine. Just a short lighter would be fine. If you're doing a larger area, because it does catch so quickly, I would suggest that you go ahead and do the long lighter. It's just for safety purposes. Let me get this going. And you just hold it to the canvas. Because there is such a small amount of gunpowder on this area right here, it won't light up quite as much as it normally would. So any residue, I'm just going to go ahead and brush off. Now we can go ahead and do some of the darker areas around the eye and the mouth as well. So this area here, as well as the ear, we can go ahead and start with that. And then we can go ahead and move on to the eye. And this, you'll be able to see a little bit more of what I'm talking about. When you use more powder, the higher the flame. So I'm going to move some of this back over. And we'll go ahead and start on the ear. And I'm following my lines, and I've gone and created some shading in the areas that I want it. And that just helps when I'm laying down the gunpowder to be able to tell what is supposed to be light and what is supposed to be dark. My reference photo, I have turned it into a sepia color, just to be able to tell the values a little bit easier. So start by just outlining what you already have, and then you can go ahead and move this other stuff in. And I'm constantly looking at my reference photo as I am moving this around, and that helps to make sure that everything that you're shading is in the correct areas. Once you light the gunpowder onto the canvas, you can't take it back out. It's not like paint where you can just paint over it. So you want to be certain that where you're laying it out is exactly where you want it before you stick the lighter to it. So this area here, I'm going to take my smudge tool, and this area here has a nice clean line going around it, and then it comes back down. And it's almost a backlit photo. It's a little bit more off to the right than a true backlit. So this side is going to get a little bit more of the light than this side. And you can see how I've laid it down where this area here is not quite as solid as this area, and that's because in my reference photo, that's the way it shows. As it goes in towards the inner canal, it's going to get darker. So those small details are what you've got to pay attention to if you're going for the realism effect. And this area comes in just a little bit. I'll pull some of that powder out. I put a little bit too much in there. Trying to follow all of the lines that I have, and it was just a sketch, so it's just as a guide. I might find that maybe it needs to be a little bit different as I go on, as I proceed, so we'll see. Now I'm going to go ahead and, let's see, almost. I'll fix this area. This area here is a little bit too wide, so I'm going to remove some of that gunpowder out of there. Okay, so we're ready to go ahead and start lighting this. I'm going to go ahead and remove any excess powder away from the canvas, even in that area. Now this is the first burn, so it's not going to be quite as dark. What I usually do is go over the area, and that makes it a little darker. And now it has burned into the canvas, and all it leaves is a layer of ash on there. So I'm going to take my blender brush and gently scoop that away. And you can see that those marks in there are now permanently in there. Now towards this area here, I want to create more depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some more gunpowder, and whatever tool you find, whatever works for you. These are the tools that I use that tend to yield the best results for me for the techniques that I use. You can try different paintbrushes. If you want to create more detail, maybe try going a little bit finer. You can experiment with different gunpowder as well. Some of them are larger flakes if you're looking more for texture and not necessarily for detail. I like the smaller textured gunpowder to create finer details, but it all depends on what you're trying to create. Now this area in the inner ear is super dark, so it can take sometimes, it can take 2, 3, 4 burns in one particular area just to create the depth. I don't suggest trying to create the depth all in one shot. I've learned that the layering process works much better and yields much better results if you just do it in sections and layer it. So I'm going to get it as clean as I can. Now, since I've already done the first burn, I don't need to worry too much about the outline of it. I am just creating some texture and depth in this ear now. So I don't need to be too precise. If one area is a little dark and one's not, all it will do is add a little bit more dimension, and it shouldn't be too noticeable. So I'm going to go ahead and relight this right here. And sometimes you have to relight it for some of the smaller specks. So I'm going to go ahead and brush that off. And you can see it's created a little bit more depth in that area. Now let's move on to the main area right here. Because it is more backlit, the top of the mane, which I didn't draw in right here, the top of the mane is going to be a little bit lighter than this area here. So what we're going to do is just focus on this main area here and creating that depth first, and then we can go ahead and do the rest. And I got this reference photo from Gary Odell, and I'm very appreciative of that because these are the Salt River horses. I am from Arizona, born and raised, and most anyone in Arizona knows about the Salt River horses. This is a photo that he took, my rendition of it, so it's just a smidge different, but this is a photo that he took of the wild horses. And if you go check him out on Facebook, he's got some excellent photos. So what I'm going to do is just follow this line that I see in my reference photo. I'm going to follow this line here, and I want that pretty thick because it is a thicker area and it is dark. So then we've got this top area here to fill in. Now I want to be careful. I've got my line here that I want to be careful of. I don't want to cover that. And I'm not worried so much about exactly getting every hair where it's supposed to go as it shows in my reference photo, because it just doesn't matter. As long as you get the general idea. That is mane, and foals seem to have some crazy hair days. So as long as you get the general idea, then you'll be good to go. So my ear starts here. So I want to make sure I don't get gunpowder in that area. And then I do need to move some more of this over here. And this area has a hump on it, so I'm going to make sure I get that area a little bit darker. So what I don't want to do with the mane, I wouldn't want to light it just as is, because the hair is going to kind of stick up a little bit here. I don't want to have this solid line that's really difficult to get out. So I will take my tool, my smudge tool, and just kind of start creating some texture in there, so that it is not such a solid line, and I can continue working the rest of it when I do the next burn. So let's go ahead and move some of this over, and I'll show you how I do the hair texture. And sometimes, as in the mare's mane, when I did that one, it comes out pretty solid of a color, and so how I get the depth, these darker colors, is by reburning those areas and just picking those areas out. So what I'm going to do is take my smudge tool and just start kind of creating textures here. And you can try different techniques and see what really seems to work for you. Different tools. These are the ones that I've experimented with. I've used different paint brushes. I've used the sponge brush. These are the ones though that really I just seem to stick to. The sponge brush, it seemed to want to pop too much and make the gunpowder move around on the canvas a little bit too much, more than I liked, so I went for the smaller detailed brushes. As you can see what I did there? I hit one of the balls, and when it does that, it pops all of the other balls out of place. So this is the part where you have to have patience, because it does happen, and this is why I used to do the entire image in one go and light it all on fire at the same time. And I learned the hard way on that because I had spent quite a bit of time doing it, and I bumped the canvas and had to restart. So what I do is just smaller sections now, and I pick one area to work on, and that seems to work best for me. So what I'm going to need a little bit more over here. So I'll take my gunpowder from this pile over here and carefully move it over. Now the more gunpowder that you have in one area, the higher your flame is going to be. So of course, if you're going to do this at home, I'm doing it inside in a nice ventilated area. However, if you're going to do it, especially for the first time, I suggest doing it outside. I used to do it outside. But if you're going to do it for the first time, just to try it, don't do anything detailed or crazy. Just give it a go. I suggest just doing it outside. That way you can judge exactly how high your flame is going to be, and you can take the appropriate measures for that. And I always have a fire extinguisher handy. I've never had any issues besides smoke detectors going off. And that's a given, so that happened mainly when I was doing the whole image at one time, because there was a significant amount of gunpowder on the canvas. It created quite a bit of smoke that would cause the smoke detectors to go off. So as you can see, I have a hard line right here. I want to fix that, so I'm just going to push it in and try to create some hair-like texture and just move it around so that it's not uniform. It doesn't look like he just had a buzz cut. He is a wild horse, so you know that his hair is going to be wild as well. And this area here, this area is going to be pretty dark around his ear, the back side of his ear, because his ear is going to be lit up by the sunlight behind. So we can start with this, and we can add some more as we go. I want to do a little bit more texture towards this area before I light it. Now you can make his hair as wild and crazy as you want. I'm gonna go with just a little bedhead. So I'm just gathering some of the loose gunpowder that I see around just to create an end towards his mane. And this area here needs a little bit more texture. And the last thing I want to do before I light it up is just clean up this area here. The neck on a horse right here is really rounded before the mane starts. So let's start with that. I'm going to go ahead and remove any excess powder. Before I begin, this area here. And this is kind of where his shoulder on the other side starts, so I want to make sure there's a hump there. And so far it looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and light that, and then you'll see what I mean by it kind of all being one color and a little bit more solid. Some of these lines won't show up quite as well, so that's why we go back in with a second layer, sometimes third, sometimes fourth layer, and create the depth as in the mare's mane. And then this patch on the top of his head. And then you just want to double check and make sure you got all of the gunpowder. Some of the loose powders around may not burn the first time, which is fine. You're just going to have to go back over it or take the lighter and go over it again. So you can see it left the mane here. It needs more texture, it's more solid because the line right here was a little bit thicker, which is what I wanted. It's much, much darker on this area because the sun is coming from the back side and lighting up from the back. So what I need to do is create some more textures in here, some more depth, and change my values a little bit in those areas. So I'm going to go ahead and scoop up some of the powder so that I can start moving it around into the areas that I want. Now right behind his ear here is fairly dark. So I want to make sure I add some more to that area. And then just work it around into some of the areas. You want the hair strands coming up because that's the way they're naturally going to go. You don't want to create lines going this way. So just pick out some areas, create some more defined hair, and that will help just overall create depth in the image. And if you're first starting out, you may want to start with even a smaller area like I did the ear. You may want to start with something small like that and complete that completely. This one still needs another layer. I need it to come over just a little bit, but complete that area first until you're comfortable, and then you can start moving on. What I did with the mare is I completed her mane first, and then I did her entire chest and legs on the next section, and then I did her face and her nose, and then created this area in the grass around it. But those are large areas, so you may want to start with smaller sections. Maybe just start with the nostril, get that completely finished. What I did was just complete a whole section here and then create the depth after that whole section. But just so you can get used to the feel of the gunpowder, and how temperamental it can be if you do bump the canvas, or if you accidentally hit it just right, it will, with one of your brushes or your smudge tool, how it can kind of pop the canvas for you, and that gets a little frustrating, especially when you've got it perfectly. So just doing smaller sections until you can get the feel of it. You won't be able to completely avoid that happening, but the more practice before you move on to a larger section would probably be beneficial. So you can see I'm just creating some smaller, chunkier pieces of hair, and that's just going to help give it some depth in those areas. And you don't have to be too particular. Because it is gunpowder, it's not like the detailed realism paintings that I do. It's not like that, so you're only going to get so much detail. So I think I'm going to start with that and go ahead and light it up, and that way I don't have to worry about it moving around. Now you can see the depth that it has created already. And this is with 2 burns. The lighter color is the first burn, the darker color is the second. Start with that, and what you want to do is, what I usually do is look for my darkest areas, and you want to obviously see the comparison of the values, and then you can determine if one area needs to go darker. Okay, so I think I'm going to begin on, let's see, I think I'm going to begin, let's do the eye and get that going. Sometimes the eye can be a little tricky just to get the highlight areas correct and to get the correct depth. So let's start with that. I'm going to move some of this powder over, and you don't want to start with too much at first, just to make sure you get the correct outline in the beginning. And I'm constantly looking at my reference photo. So what I'm going to do is just create the outline and not worry about the filling in of it on the first burn. I'm using just a small amount, and I tend to do that on the first outline area just to make sure that it's exactly where I want it to be. So this area here comes in a little bit. then it has some shadows underneath here, so this area here will be okay to leave. And then once we burn this part, we can do a little bit of the eyelid area. And I just want to clean that up and make sure I don't have any scragglers, just to make the lines a little bit cleaner. So let's start with that. Remove this excess powder out of the way. Brush off the excess. Now we can go ahead and start filling it in a little bit more. There is a highlight on this eye. And it's off to the right a little bit. So I want to make sure I leave that area clear. For this small area, the smudge tool seems to really make the difference. And this area here is fairly dark in this corner, so I want to add a little bit more powder to this area. And usually with smaller detailed areas, what I like to do is just do a little bit at a time and burn a small amount into the canvas and make sure that you like that area first, and then you can go and create your darker, deeper colors in that area. It just helps build up the depth gradually. And this process of gunpowder art does take a lot of patience if you're looking to achieve a detailed version. It does take patience. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and light that up. Move the excess out of the way. And we'll just continue building. So you can see it's getting gradually darker. I do need this corner of the eye to be darker because the light source is coming from this side. Naturally, anything on this side is going to be darker. So I'm going to build that up and just suggest some shadowing in that area. That helps to really create the form of his face. When you've got more dimension, areas of highs and lows, it really helps to create the correct form. Okay, so that's a little bit darker. I'm going to go ahead and light that up. Okay. Now, even darker still right in this corner here. Okay. Now you can see it's created quite a bit more depth than the original burn. And I'll still need to work on this area, but I just want to get the deepest, darkest values in. So the next area, let's see, the next area is probably going to be this mouth, right where his lip is. Let me go ahead and get that area all completed to show some of the values. Follow your lines that you've created, as well as continually checking your reference. And generally the first burn, the outline areas, when you're doing just mainly outline areas, it's going to look a little goofy at first until you get the different values and depths in there. So just know that you don't have to get it perfect on the first burn. You can start tightening up your lines on future burns. This area towards his mouth is fairly dark, so it will take a decent amount of gunpowder on that area. Okay, so this area, and let me get my smudge tool and clean out some of the lines. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and light that up right there. Just make sure I got all of it. Okay, now let's see. Okay, so I think we're gonna do the nostril first, and then we will start working on the entirety of the face, and that's probably what I'll try to complete today. So I'm gonna create a small pile around the nose, and then I can start forming it, paying attention to my reference photo, creating those lines and textures, starting with a smaller amount at the beginning. I want to stick with the natural curvature of the nose. And that's why it is super important for a nice clear reference photo, because that allows you to be able to zoom in and really see the detail. If you don't have that, it makes this process very difficult and almost impossible to get a realistic portrait done. So I'm going to take my smudge tool, start designing the line. This area is pretty bright right here, and it comes down this way, and then bring some more over. So this area comes in. And just continue working it until you get the correct outline. And sometimes doing the outer areas, like this area here, this area helps you really see the shapes that you're trying to achieve. This area needs to come down just a little bit. It's going to go up. And this area in here is in shadow, but it's not quite as dark as this area inside the nostril. So what I'm mainly going to focus on is just inside the nostril, creating that depth. Moving the powder around until I get everything laid where I want. And sometimes by moving it one way, it'll shift the other side, and you just have to keep playing with it. Let's see. It's just about where I want it.
here where the nostril kind of extends, so I want to make sure I cut that point off. And as long as I get the general idea on the first burn, I can go back in with the next burn and really create the depth. And all that this burn is doing is creating some color to kind of go off of, where it's not pure white. Okay, so let's go ahead and burn that, and then we can deepen it in areas even more. So this area in here is really dark, so I want to make sure I define that area a little bit more than the rest. The light is hitting the tip of his nostril here and the outer area right here. So here and here, and inside is going to be fairly dark. So since I have that initial burn, I don't need to worry too much about where it's at, as long as it's generalized darker in the areas that I want. Okay, let's start with that. Clean this area up just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to start with that. Okay. Now this line around this area here, around the bridge of his nose, this line is going to be a smidge darker, so I'm just going to take it and line some gunpowder just so I can keep my lines in that area. And just start adding some dimension. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and light that. Okay. Now this area as well, this is his lips right here, and this area here is going to be in shadow, so I need to add some gunpowder to that area because it is fairly dark, and this will help give him his lips the form that they are. He has a muscle running from here to his jaw, and when you are doing horses, that's one of their trademarks, is the muscles that you see in their face. So I want to take the deepest line, because there are a few shades of this. I want to take the deepest line and start working the gunpowder into that area, and continually keep layering to deepen that area before I move on to the lighter areas. And he has a dark area here underneath his lip. So we'll go ahead and add that in. And like I said, it's going to look a little funny at first because these areas are so bright. They don't have any light to them or depth yet. So it is going to look as if this area is just sectioned out and doesn't seem to fit. But as we progress, it will make sense. But we just need to determine the values first. Underneath his chin is fairly dark, as well as this area here. So I'm going to go ahead and scoop some more. Use my blender brush to bring a larger pile to this area. So right under here is going to be fairly dark, so I'm going to bring some more into this area. And I'm just looking for the shape, the external shape of his face right here. I'm just paying attention on my reference photo to the outline, not worrying about any of the shading in here. And then his jawline as well, where his jaw begins. Horses are known for very muscular jaws, so we want to make sure it's not a straight line across. There's always going to be almost a U shape in this area. I'm going to do a thin line here just to break up this area so I can determine my depth here. Clean up the outer line, perimeter. And then it continues into here, and in here it gets fairly dark as well. So while we're doing that, we can go ahead and fill that in with a little bit more. Just double checking my lines and make sure. I'm just looking at the outer perimeter of my reference photo and making sure that the shape, the general shape is the same. And this area here is part of his neck, so you don't want it to curve here and then come up here. there's almost like an upside down U, a mountain that goes right here, or hill, that connects his head to his neck, and it's not a straight line like that. It is more rounded. Since I have a little excess, I'm just going to pull it down around the perimeter of his neck right here. And then this area here and some of this area is actually going to be in shadow here, but these are the darkest areas in that shadow. So that's all I'm worried about. I'm not worried about creating the depth at this point. The darkest shadows and the general shape of the perimeter is all that I want to do at this moment. And the good thing with the gunpowder is that you can see the way it's going to burn, or see what your outline is before you put it on, before you make it permanent by burning it. And it's fairly easy just to keep maneuvering it until you get the correct shape that you want. Right under his chin, I need that area a little bit more defined. I think I've made his neck a little bit too wide. And then this is going to come up like this. And the way the shadows are, it's not a solid line. So I don't want a solid line. Okay. I think that will be good for now. Just double check my perimeter, make sure it's, because as you work on a different part of the canvas, it can slightly make some of the other parts move. So right before I burn, I always make sure I recheck that. Okay, so I'm going to move this pile away, and then we'll be ready to burn. Okay, so we'll brush off the excess of that. next thing would be, we can work on this area here. And this area here is also in shadow and very dark. So you can see I'm just kind of building up my pile in this area. And then I can take my tool and my brush and add the textures and the shapes that I see in the reference photo. From the bottom of his ear. And I'm just gently tapping to spread the gunpowder out so that I can start kind of carving out some of where I see the highlights. There's a muscle going this way in the neck that's highlighted. And then this area, there's a bone right above the eye, and that area is also highlighted. So I want to make sure I carve that out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is make sure my finger is nice and dry, and I'm going to gently push on it and then pull some of the powder down, and that creates some shading texture. Okay. I'm going to readjust my lines. This will definitely make more sense as the shading gets darker. Any areas that are highlighted, you want to make sure that your brightest highlights aren't going to receive any of the gunpowder in that area, because you can't make it any brighter than what your background is. And if you add gunpowder to that area, that's the color that you're going to be stuck with. So you want to make sure you clean out any areas that are highlighted before you light it. And this line kind of comes up. And we'll need to put in an eyelid in this area. And I'll do that after I burn the shadowed area. Just continue pushing it around until you get it exactly where you want it. Like I said, it takes a lot of patience. And I'm constantly checking my reference photo. And I think I look at my reference photo more than I look at my paintings sometimes. Okay. Okay. Continually working it, removing any areas that are not going to be burned. Just cleaning it up. And that really allows me to see what that's, if I have it correct, if I really want to burn it there. And I think I'm happy with that. I'll go ahead and burn that and then we can go from there. So it's starting to come together. He does need more shadowing in this area to create a rounded effect. So we'll go ahead and do that. Bring some gunpowder over. And I can kind of pick out where the highlights are. this area here needs to be dark as well. So let me bring some over there. Making this really dark in here underneath the outer part of his nostril really makes it look more three-dimensional. And really helps form the face. So let me take my smudge tool, clean up this line here. This area here is fairly bright. I'm just going to try to feather that out a little bit to help create a shadow and not a hard line. And then his lip right here will also need to be shadowed. The main line is going to be right here where the highlight will be, and the rest needs a little bit of shadow. So let me go ahead and light that. We can start with that. So we want to add a little bit of shadow, not quite as bright as I want this area here. And then up underneath his lip here needs to be a little bit darker as well as right here. So I'll go ahead and fill that in. I'm going to shorten the lip area a little bit. my smudge tool and re-emphasize some of the highlight areas and just push the gunpowder out of the way in those areas. And I generally like this side of the smudge tool. This one is good for really tiny areas, but I seem to use the more angled one much more. It's just much more universal. Okay, now the lip needs to be, kind of comes out in this area and then back down and around. So I just need to reinforce that shape. Okay. And let's go ahead and burn that, and then I'll add a little bit more shading to his lip area. So I need to clean up around. Okay. And let's see. Let's reinforce the depth on his mouth in this area here, because that is the darkest area around his mouth. So I want to make sure that those values are correct. And that's what gives your painting or your gunpowder art, your drawing, any of it, that's what gives it the realism, is having that correct depth. Just trying to pick out different shapes that I see, angles that are on my reference photo. Making sure I get those correct because they really do make all the difference. Now there is a triangle shape right here, and that's because their lips aren't perfectly round. They're a little bit more squared off. So I'm just going to gather up a small amount and create a darker area here. And it's not a super solid line right here. As you can see, that makes it look as if it's got a divot right there, and it's not quite that solid. So if I feather the gunpowder out a little bit, it helps to soften that line. Okay. Go ahead and burn that, so remove the excess from around. Okay. So his mouth looks pretty good. His nostril area is super dark in here, so I do need to add some more in that area. And I'll do it a little bit thicker on the gunpowder just to help create some of that depth that I'm looking for without having to do quite so many layers. Okay. Just clean up my line a little bit where my hard highlight is, just to make sure I keep that intact. Okay, so let's go ahead and burn that. And you can see how much darker that made that area. Which is exactly the way that I want it. Right here in the corner of his eye, that area also needs to be darker. So let's go ahead and build up our values there. And really the first layers are probably the most difficult, because once the gunpowder is on there already, all you have to do is pick out areas that you want darker and maintain your highlight areas. So naturally, anything that's darker is going to make the surrounding areas around it look lighter. So as long as you maintain your really bright areas that don't have any gunpowder on them, everything around it is going to start to look darker and darker as you keep going. Okay, so now right underneath his eye here, there is a muscle that runs this way. So I need to shadow this area just to give it a little bit more of a shape. Because this whole side of his body is in shadow, with only some areas having the highlight on it because the sun is coming from this direction. So I need to make sure this whole area isn't left bright because it makes it look like the sun is coming from this direction. We can go ahead and emphasize the eyelid area. If you're a graphite artist, it's very similar, or if you paint a lot in black and white or sepia, it's a very similar concept where you need to leave, you're almost working in reverse instead of putting your darks in, as in painting, when you put in your darks, then you cover it with your light spots. When you are drawing, you need to make sure you leave your light spots because you can't ever get that white of the paper back. So it's kind of the same concept. And graphite isn't something that I do very often, so I'm sure a graphite artist would have a much easier time doing this than a colorist painter, but it can be done for sure. Okay, now I don't want this line to be too hard of a line, so I'm going to go in and just kind of tap and move it around so that it creates a little bit of a texture there. And okay, So I'm going to go ahead and light that. Let me brush off any excess. Okay. And now you can see how much more dimension it has. And let's darken this ear area just a little bit. And then we can go ahead and create the outline of the ear. And I highly suggest that if you're painting, drawing, doing the gunpowder art, use a reference photo, a really high quality reference photo, because it really makes your job much easier, especially if your goal is for realism. Any realist painter, drawer, anything uses a reference photo. There's very, very few that don't, but if you're looking for realism or hyperrealism, you definitely need a reference photo, especially in the beginning stages. If you're just starting out with drawing, you really need a reference photo until you start learning the anatomy of things. So this area here is really bright. It's being backlit, this area. So I want to make sure I maintain that. And then it gradually gets darker as it curves around right here. And then need a little bit of a line to show the ear here, kind of coming in. And we'll go in and add, after I burn this, we'll go in and add a few textures here. This area comes in a little bit and then comes out this way a little bit more. Okay, so for the first burn, And just adjust that a little bit. For the first burn, this will work, and then we can add a little bit more shading. Brush away the excess. Good. Now let's make this area right here a little bit darker. It's not quite as bright right there on the reference photo. There's a few bright spots, but it needs more color in that area. I'm going to bring some from around the other side. Okay, now I can go through and add some of my bright spots and push this around just a little bit. Okay, I think that's good. Good. Now let me show you how I do the shading to round out the jaw right here. I'm just going to gather up some of this gunpowder here, and you can see I'm kind of flicking, and that just creates a natural spray of gunpowder. And I can kind of move this around just a little bit, being very gentle until it gets exactly where I want it. And then there's a dark line here because there's a bone muscle that goes this way, and then it starts with his jaw muscle. So right in here, to create the roundness, I need some light right in this area at the tip of the roundness. And then also his jawline right here. And I don't want perfectly straight lines, so that's why I keep going over and kind of brushing and tapping, creating a different texture. Fairly easy, so let's go ahead and burn that. And that will leave little spots. And you can see it just adds a little bit of texture. And then I can take even more and create a deeper shadow in this area here. So let's do that. And that really just helps to emphasize the gradient as it comes around. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and light that. And you can keep adding to make it darker. And let's see if there's any areas that need to be a little darker. We can go ahead and add those. Actually, I think that's good so far. So we'll just complete that for today, and then we'll work on working our way down for tomorrow. And yes, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask on my YouTube channel. Like, share, subscribe, comment. I answer any questions that you may have. I'm really excited to start doing some tutorials for everybody and showing them my process. In the future, after I finish this one, I may even do another gunpowder one. If not, I will be doing acrylic paintings, oil paintings, all different things. So if you have suggestions as to what you would like to see me do, whether it's gunpowder, oil, acrylic, pastels, if there's any subject that you would like me to do and the medium, please let me know and I see what I can do. I appreciate you all tuning in. Thanks and have a great day.